Hello, I'm Brad Nickason and welcome to Tri-City Community TV's Roundtable. We're here at Port Moody's Station Museum. Right now I'm going to read a land acknowledgement because this is for today's subject. This is really important to get right, and I want to do my best on this. I want to acknowledge that Tri-City Community TV's Roundtable takes place on the unceded Coast Salish territory. This is the traditional territory of the Kwikwetlem First Nations, which lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Squamish, and Stolo nations. Many of us are settlers and visitors in this land that has never been legally sold or traded, but instead, unfortunately, taken. I also recognize that it's our shared responsibility in moving forward with reconciliation to guarantee social justice for all. And that's an important statement for what we're going to be talking about today. To those points, considering the idea of reconciliation, today's discussion revolves around the idea of revisiting names, historical names that settlers have put on places. And we're going to be talking about how those names are starting to change. That process is going on right now. I want to introduce our important panel. Today's panel includes Chief Ed Hall of the Kwikwetlem Nation, Amy Ann Lubik, who is a health researcher and a councillor for the city of Port Moody. And we also have Craig Hodge, who is also a councillor, but for the city of Coquitlam. And Craig is also a past president of the Coquitlam Historical Society. Did I get that right, yes. Craig? Yep. That's right. Thank you all for being here. To provide a little context of our conversation today, I'd like to provide a little context of some things that have happened right here in our backyard, some right here in our backyard and in the Lower Mainland. Recently, Riverview has changed, the name Riverview in the Coquitlam area has changed to, and I'm going to, please correct me if I get this wrong, but it's Samiquaela.
Correct.
Is that better?
Correct.
Sorry, it's going to take me a couple times to get that. And also, recently, we've seen the name change in Balcarra Regional Park. That's in Balcarra. The name of that is Tumta'ihutun? Tumta'hi?
Tumta'ihutun.
Because that's an interesting thing about what's happening is these are new names to people. And it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I think this challenge is good for us. It's a good challenge to take on. It shows that we're trying to grow as people. There's also some talk about changing Dewdney Trunk Road. A local teacher at one of the middle schools, I think, has asked to change the name. Their grade 9 social studies class has put forward to Port Moody and I think Coquitlam to change the name of Dewdney Trunk Road. And these are because of connotations to the people these roads are named after. I think it's probably, there are other things as well, but I think it's time to get right into the questions. I'd like to probably start with you, if you don't mind, Ed. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a little about your interest in this subject and what work you've been doing in this area, if that makes sense to you.
In my interest in the subject of renaming Dewdney Trunk Road, which passed through...
Well, I think in general, the entire subject. Sorry if I didn't make that clear.
Yeah.
It's a bit obvious, but...
Yeah, it's to, to move along the path of reconciliation, to come up with a name. I know it's going to be a multi-jurisdictional process, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight or in the next few weeks or months. And I really have to, raise my hands and my hat to, the students of Charles Best Secondary School for, coming up with that idea and all those fantastic letters that they wrote. And I have been asked by the teacher, Megan, if I could go up here and go, have a chat with the students, just to make an appearance and just, give them my kudos, to the initiative that they've embarked on, and just to be able to speak to that a little bit, and sometime in the next couple of months or so, I said I would do that. And yeah, it would mean a lot to not only the First Nation, locally as Kwikwetlem and Tsleil-Waututh, but also to many others and to others in general who actually do have, some sort of an understanding of what it is, what reconciliation's about, and all the initiatives that come out of that, moving forward, and everybody can collaboratively work together and move on a good path.
I think I'd like to pass this question also to Amy, about your interest in this subject and what you've been doing in this area as well.
For sure. I also am very grateful to the students from Charles Best for bringing this forward. Reconciliation has been a very important topic in Port Moody, and part of that has been trying to address, and Chief Ed has been very helpful in helping us understand how we go about trying to address the 5 I think it's more than 5 calls for municipal governments in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And one of those calls is to really look at what's the history of this land before colonization, and what has been the effect of colonization on the peoples who have been here since time immemorial. Understanding that colonization has had very traumatic effects on a lot of Indigenous peoples across the world, it's very important to understand that the historical figures that sometimes we have our streets or buildings named after did take part in some pretty horrendous things. For Dewdney Trunk, which we brought forward to Port Moody Council, Edgar Dewdney was part of institutionalization of residential schools and keeping children away from their families, and also complicit in the starving of different nations and Métis peoples in order to get them to comply with treaties. And I can only imagine what it would be like for me if someone that had decimated my family had their name up on the streets that I passed every day. So I think this is an extremely important topic for us to take on, and I think it's integral to our work on reconciliation, although we do have to keep working on all of the other issues connected as well, and the other calls for action.
And I'd like to ask you the same question, Craig. Where do you stand within this? What is your interest in it, and what areas have you been working with?
Well, I think that there's a new awareness of what roles local governments need to play. I think that the community as a whole is becoming more aware of the past and what has transpired. I think that certainly the students have recognized that, and I think that more and more students and the general public are becoming aware of the past. I think that as somebody who was, for years I've been involved in history and the history of this area. And I think that, while we were always aware that we were not the first people on these lands, we tended to look at history from the day colonization began. And I think that this is where we now have to take a step further back and sort of say, what is the true history of this area? What part did colonization take part? What was the role that colonization played in this? The negative aspects of it. I think in the past, history has celebrated the positive aspects of it, the building of roads and infrastructure and the progress and the commercialization of the land and the industries that built this province. But I think you have to take a step back and sort of say, what was it like before that took place? place. And I think that this is a conversation that's beginning now. It's happening at all levels. It's happening with the provincial government, the federal government, United Nations. We're looking at UNDRIP, DRIPA, and how do we move forward with reconciliation in a meaningful way? And I think that's really what the important part of this is that what can we do that's meaningful to our First Nations and to the residents today? And some of that may be looking at making changes in naming. We've seen across this country statues come down. We've seen major sports teams change their names because in today's day and age, they're no longer seen as being something that's supportive, in some cases offensive by today's standards. And so we are seeing corporations changing logos. As I said, major sporting teams have changed names. And I think that is in keeping with the way that society is moving today.
I hear what you're saying with regards to that our society is moving that way, but I think what I would like to do is take what you've said, and I'd like to put a question to you, Ed, with regards to what Craig has said about the meaning of this kind of movement, about the meaning of these kinds of actions by people in authority or the people who govern us per se. What is the meaning to First Nation people?
The way I see that with the removal of statues and name changes, logo changes, and all of that, that have happened after colonization. What it does is it takes away these lasting images that one might see, and if they know history about it, these are going to be like triggers, for trauma, because multiple generations of Indigenous folks from the late 1800s forward to as recently as 1996 have actually went through a lot of these different kinds of traumas with the residential institutions. I myself am actually an intergenerational survivor. My late father was actually in one of these for 10 years of his life, so he got pulled into there when he was just a child at St. Mary's out in Mission City there, and even his surviving sister-in-law right now, and married to my uncle over there, she was actually in Kamloops for 11 years of her young life. And then she went on to become a teacher for 34 years. But what it would do is it would just remove a lot of the triggers and the reminders and whatnot. And it's also acknowledging, the presence of First Peoples, and also, it really, acknowledges and recognizes, the people are there, and it helps, in a way to actually try and remove away reminders of some horrendous pasts that have happened, to earlier generations and whatnot, for the children that never made it home, and then for those ones that are surviving and the intergenerational survivors that follow them.
So it's like addressing trauma. It's like what Amy had said. It's a bit of a health, not a bit. It's a health issue. Addressing trauma and providing relief to people who see those names every day and are, in some means, even if it's unconsciously, reminded of the things that have happened to them. And so it's a big thing to make these changes, but it's not a big thing, is it, either?
No, it's not the hardest thing in the world. There's things that are much harder and, that are, too much to deal with there, but these things are just simple little incremental steps to move towards, something that we can all have pride in moving forward, and,
Maybe I can ask Amy, what does this process look like in your community's level? Like, it's obviously something brought to the city council. What does that look like? What happens in that process?
What it looks like is an opportunity. And I know that sounds kind of
No, that's all right.
political, but one of the things that we learned going forward when we're trying to, like I said, address those calls to action, is that we don't have a lot of the processes in place to work together with the nations whose territories we're on, to come up with a new name or to address, let's say, some economic reconciliation around partnerships, to look at how we communicate with each other when we're doing, land planning. We don't have those processes in place in a really good way right now. Like we can send a letter to Chief Ed and your community, but there's a lot of more meaningful communication channels that we need to establish in order to make these things really meaningful.
So this is a learning opportunity I'm searching for the right term to use in this, and I apologize because this is I imagine this is a new subject to a lot of people who are day to day not steeped in it, and I have to admit that is me. I'm that person. So I'm going to use the word for the settler. I almost want to say nation, for settlers. How about settlers?
Yeah.
For settlers,
yeah.
this is a process for those of us who are settlers to learn to work with our partners in Canada, our First Nations partners in Canada. Does that make sense? So is that what you're saying? It's an opportunity for us to learn, for everyone to learn. It's a difficult situation that we're all learning about.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. When I first brought this forward, because the students reached out, I went to our city manager and said, how would we go about doing this? And he was just like, it's a good idea, but I don't know, because we've never really tried to do that before, because we were like, okay, well, we have to talk to all of the communities that Dewdney Trunk goes through. And they're like, well, what about the Indigenous communities that this goes through? Because of course, if we're wanting to rename it, we want to rename it and something that actually is meaningful or makes sense in the spirit of reconciliation. And that goes through a lot of different communities. So,
right. Is that the same experience for you in Coquitlam when the issue was brought forward? I'm assuming that it was brought to both communities. The topic was brought to both communities at the same time. Is that a similar situation?
Well, yeah, and we received the letter from the students, and we were very interested in their proposal. We took a different approach in that we certainly have a street naming policy that actually is coming up for review right now, and also a strategic heritage plan that's being worked on. So we saw this as an opportunity to look at those plans and work that's already underway and say, can this type of work be incorporated into what we're already doing? I wouldn't say it's a big task, but I wouldn't say it's an easy task. There are some things that would have to be worked out before you do rename a street. And certainly there's a lot of legal issues, land issues, and which is not to say that we shouldn't do it. We just need to know more about what would be involved in doing it. And how do you work with First Nations to look at it? And is this the only street? Are there other areas? And I think in the overall topic of reconciliation, where does this fit into the priorities of our First Nations? In terms of, we've heard from Chief Hall today that this is something that they're interested in, and so that forms part of the conversation. But I think that when we look at reconciliation and UNDRIP and DRIPA and what the role of municipal government is going to be, we don't really know for sure yet. Amy and myself both sit on the Union of BC Municipalities. We're just learning now what those roles are going to be, and we're looking for the province for clarification on things we can do. Some things we can do fairly easily, such as naming. We have control over street names. We have control over the names of parks. I'm a member of Metro Vancouver's regional district, sit on the Parks Committee. So I was involved in the decision to rename Belcarra Park. and also the decision to reach out to the Tsleil-Waututh to look at a joint management for that park. So we're starting to see these kinds of conversations happening at different levels. And I think that what's encouraging is that we're seeing the public saying, yes, you're going in the right direction, and that these are things that are becoming priorities for the general public, not just for our First Nations. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we're actually seeing buy-in and people wanting to move in that direction. And it starts with students, it starts with things that looking at names. As somebody who's been interested in history, I myself was not aware of Edgar Dewdney. I was aware of the town of Dewdney. I was aware of Dewdney Trunk, the role that road played in the early development of British Columbia. Mm-hmm. But I hadn't explored back further to where the name had originated. And I think that this is where these conversations are starting to happen now. And as I said, history didn't begin with settlement. History went way beyond that. And that's some of the things we're starting to learn now.
Mm-hmm. Some of the things that I was reading about this subject prior to today is I saw the suggestion that maybe we should be being proactive in going and looking at those names. How do you feel about that?
I think that that's something that probably First Nations should be looking at. I think that one of the concerns that I've had is through history, people that look like me have done a lot of the decision making. And I think that we have to move away from that, and we have to say, no, let's go start right from the beginning and go back to our First Nations and see what their priorities are. I mean, it's great that people and the students are becoming aware, but I think if we're going to look at other names or other streets, they need to be involved in that conversation, because I don't know what are the things that matter most to our First Nations. They're the ones that know, and I think they should be at the very front of those discussions.
So let me move to you, Ed, and ask you this question. Along the lines of what Craig's saying, I think my question's a little bit different, but do you think that is the responsibility of people like us to go back into history, or is that something that First Nations people should take the lead on that? Or should it be more of a partnership?
I think it could be a pretty good partnership. I know that the province, looking back at my emails, the province has actually got an initiative underway too about place names, different kind of sites that kind of reminds us of our own history, and that place markings, different kinds of things like that. If you look through the whole Stall region of the Lower Fraser, there's, the mountains have their own certain kinds of names, and there's different features that have names. They're all, Halkamalum and Hunkaminum, and for this area anyways, from about Yale downward to the mouth. It's those two dialects there. And we ourselves, of the Kwikwetlem First Nation, have been involved in it to a small degree, more locally so far, and ours goes up as far as Coquitlam Lake, but it's something that we can achieve, I think, together, and it's it wouldn't be a better idea than that out there that I can think of. Let's work on it, and let's get a table, and we'll get both sides represented on it, or all sides, depending on how many different entities are involved in that. Let's take a look at it from that kind of an approach. I think would be great.
So what, as we've been speaking, something that's starting to rattle around my head is, earlier you mentioned that this is a multi-governmental challenge, and now I'm starting to think that we have many partners, and it's multi-governmental in a sense. Is this something that we should be looking to our federal government to take the lead on as well, to bring these partners together? And what has your experience been with that?
Well,
are they willing to do that?
Well, the federal government, they are, gradually moving the UNDRIP initiative across coast to coast to coast, and really, I think it's probably needs to be just more focused locally, as like a Kwikwetlem and a Coquitlam city and a Port Moody city and a Port Coquitlam city and that kind of thing. And then provincially, they're already doing their initiative of making an invite. They're creating a table where where there can be place names brought into the picture. So that's getting acknowledged. And
so it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the federal government is doing its part to enact under it. But when it comes to an issue like we're talking about, this does come down to the communities. With communities, and in our case, we're in the Tri-Cities, so it is the three communities should be working with you to look at those things. And is that what you would like to see going forward?
It's an absolutely good idea as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Is that happening? Are all the communities working with you?
Oh, well, these kinds of things are, just at their infancy stages right now too. So, once the ball gets rolling on it, it'll gain some momentum, and there'll probably get multiple entities involved in, getting something set up for a table to be able to have these kind of discussions.
Okay. I'd like to switch and maybe backtrack a little bit, because Craig, you've been very encouraging about the idea of our society moving forward on this, and it's quite encouraging to hear that. But somewhere in the back of my head, I continue to hear that there are going to be people who are pushing back against this. Are we finding any of that? And I think more importantly, and I'm not sure if we covered this, because I think people are going to hear it and want to push back. They just, for whatever reason. Why is it important? I hope we haven't covered this, but why should they get on board? How is it important, and how does it benefit their lives to get on this?
Well, I think that there's going to be naturally pushback anything that's new. I mean, we've seen this on environmental initiatives, whether it's how we manage our garbage or other things, or how we conserve water, and some of the things that are very important to us.
Yeah.
And it takes some time. And I think that and I sit on the National Zero Waste Council of Canada, and one of the things that I've seen is that you need to have everybody going in the same direction. And the other thing that's been very, I think, gratifying, and over the years I've watched in some of the recycling initiatives, it really does start with our younger people. And that's why I was so encouraged when I saw this conversation started from the students in grade 9. I think that for people who've lived here for a longer period of time, they may have a little more trouble accepting change. It may have a bigger impact on their lives than somebody who's younger. And I don't think this is going to be something that we're going to be able to resolve in the next 2 years. But I think the more we start these conversations and bring into the reasons why we need to have these conversations, I think that over time we will gain support. It's easy for a government to just say, this is the way it's going to be, and make a legislative change. But I think to be successful, you have to have the buy-in from the people, the community. And that's what's going to be, I think, really important as we move forward with reconciliation. I think that some of the terrible news that came out last year around the residential schools, I think was a real eye-opener for a lot of people. And so we see this now, and I think people now recognize that there was trauma involved in this. This isn't just symbolic. This is really important to a lot of people who live in our community. And I think that when I look at even our community today in general, our community has become very diverse, very multicultural. It's very different from when I moved here 60 years ago. And I think part of embracing change and a community is to look at all the members of our community and make sure that everybody feels welcome in our community, and that we don't have anything lingering from the past that makes them feel uncomfortable being here in our community.
So it's about inclusivity.
It's absolutely about inclusivity. And Coquitlam has just hired a new manager of equity, diversity, and inclusion, because this has become one of our 8 priorities for the next year, is working on inclusivity and looking at equity, and also looking at how we're going to deal with First Nations. And so we actually put that in as a budget item into our budget last fall.
So Amy, I'm going to ask you, that it looked like you were going to add to that, and thank you for doing that.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about that position. I know that City of Victoria has a similar one. I'm wondering if that's something Port Moody can bring in too, with only a couple of months left until the next election, but still. Something that got me thinking was, it does start with education and inclusion, but also, and sometimes this is hard to hear because the comment sections can sometimes be really difficult to read, but we do live in a society that's based on systemic racism. Like, there are certain people that are prioritized. And that's not to say that the people in the system are trying to go out and be overtly racist or no. It's more to say that our society is based on a way that tends to focus on the benefits to and uplift the rights of specifically like older white able-bodied gentlemen. And there's a lot of unlearning that we need to do, and there's a lot of systems in place that we need to investigate. And I'm so excited you guys have that office now to investigate it. That we need to investigate and dismantle whatever might be in the way of everybody having equitable access to our systems. We're right now, Port Moody is looking into anti-bias and anti-racism training for all staff and council as well, which I think is really important, because we do have policies that if something happens, someone comes forward if there's a racist incident. But we also want to prevent those things from happening, and we want to make sure that everybody feels safe. And so, like, when we look at making sure that all of our systems and our communities are fair, there's a lot of folks that have been disenfranchised, and particularly Indigenous communities, since colonization as settlers, that have, undergone, as you said, like huge trauma and displacement and families torn apart. And we really need to look at how we might be unintentionally perpetuating some of those systems.
Right. So Ed, then, is this what reconciliation looks like then? When we're hearing councillors talking like this, is this what reconciliation looks like?
It's definitely a good part of the conversation in general, the broader one. We don't really have a template for it, but we can all work on templates together and or share each other's versions of things. I'd like to liken it to I go back to my paternal grandfather. He was in the Stalo Nation, and back then he had a name Perrier, and so he had a mixed blood then, and because they couldn't spell his name out in the Halkomelem upriver dialect, they switched it to the R's out of there and put N's, so it became Penier. So and I like to think of the story with of the 4 R's that I've come to think about since reconciliation talks have been coming to light and around and about and everything. Is recognition, respect, reset, and repeat. That's a letter R that I like to use when it comes to reconciliation.
Yeah. So as we're talking and as we're speaking about these things, and I can't get out of my mind the core idea of the trauma that many of the place names that we're looking at changing are, and I also look at like what's happened with Semiquela. On that land is now, as it was before, formerly as Riverview, it was a place of getting over trauma, and now Semiquela it plays a part in that now, does it not? That's what that area is about as well, which I think is a really good part of this story.
Yeah, we're helping reshape that and bringing back some of what it used to be hundreds of years ago, and we endorse mental health and wellness journeys and whatnot for folks that are the clients of the 2 facilities that are there, and when we do get our own future developments too, we want to be able to complement health, because we know there's a strain on those systems and whatnot. That's how I look at things. But Semiquela, it's translated to place of the great blue heron. I mean, that just goes back a long ways when the whole area used to be just vast forests and lots of creatures running around there, and not getting driven out of the places where they live and eat and whatnot. So it is really it's really, really heartening and uplifting to be able to have these, places, get their traditional ancestral names back to, to modern times now, and they're not forgotten about.
So for me, in a sense, so in my imagination, that is that land going back to its original owners, being transformed into more of what it traditionally was, that begins to feel like that reconciliation and not a performative act. A performative act in just changing a name, which this subject is about today. Because that's a fear of mine, is that we just end up changing names or tearing down statues like, forgive me, was it not the Gassy Jack statue that was taken down? And I understand the passions that are inside of people that, especially if they're trauma driven, that would want to do those kind of things. But I fear that that's just an action, and it has no meat on its bones, because it begins to look like just an act of violence. But what we've seen transform here in Kwikwetlem, at Semiquala, hopefully I'm saying that correctly.
Good, very good.
What we're seeing is what it really looks like as reconciliation, and it's a reconciliation that we can all benefit from. By just those lands are lands that we can still walk on and enjoy the forest canopy that's there. We can enjoy the tranquility of that area if we go and visit it. It is the Coquitlam Nation's land once again. It's returned to them, but it's something that we can all enjoy, that transformation. Am I not correct in that?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's
And so is that's what reconciliation begins to look to. Am I?
Well, yeah, and I think that Sequoia is a good example of an opportunity. I chaired for many years the Riverview Lands Advisory Committee. Okay. And we worked with the province and various stakeholders of what the future of that land was going to be. And as most recently as 5 years, those discussions did not have the emphasis on First Nations and reconciliation that they do today. Mm-hmm. So this is an opportunity for us to look at how those lands can be used. It's amazing. It's 244 acres there, and there's 2 new hospitals have been built. The history has always been for health and for mental health and caring. And I mean, you can argue about some of the treatments and things that were in the past, but at the time, people were doing as best they could to help people. And now we have that opportunity to move beyond that part of history. Fortunately, the lands are pretty much all intact. There's some historical buildings there. Some of them may be representative of colonial past, so there may be some opportunities to do some things with some of those buildings. But the challenge always with lands today is, how do you share the lands, recognize the past ownership, move forward with that, and find something that everybody can come to an agreement on. And I think that hearing Chief Hall talk about the opportunities for healing and things, I think that's something that we can all agree on. I think we can all agree that we want to preserve the lands and the trees and the beautiful trees that were there. And this was one of the things that came up very early in the discussions on Riverview, was the protection of the lands. And so now we have that opportunity to sit down with First Nations, whether it's with the province, BC Housing, who's still caring for the land, but they have shown a real willingness to work with the First Nations. We've seen some naming taking place, certainly way more consultation than we've ever seen in the past. And so I think this really presents us an opportunity to do something really special with those lands.
Can I add something from a health perspective? I'm actually thinking about a webinar I attended last week. It was by the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, and it was on climate change and Indigenous traditional knowledge. And one of the things that I've been thinking about ever since has been that there is data, there are studies that show that land that has been governed more consistently by Indigenous nations tends to have more biodiversity, tends to be healthier, tends to be more resilient in a changing climate. And I think the opportunities that we're seeing that go along with renaming of, let's say, Belcarra, which is, I have not memorized how to say it properly yet.
I can find it for you here. Tamte'ihu Tuatun?
I'd actually like to see the Hunkaminam spelling for it, because Tsleil-Waututh is the same dialect, so I'd be able to read it.
And I'm going to apologize
so
because
sorry.
before I came, I went to our website because Metro Vancouver, I should be able to pronounce this, and the link to the pronunciation was missing. I've always said Tumtamantuk, but I don't think that's correct either. But I think it's Tumtamum. And
Ton.
Yeah.
Ton.
Yeah.
I have a phonetic spelling of it. But sorry, I won't interrupt you.
Yeah,
I went
that's
there.
all right. Like I said, I want to learn how to say that properly. But I think that the opportunity for renaming and is a step in the right direction. But as you said, Brad, it's not the, there's that act, and then what? And so things like the co-governance of land is not only important for kind of a more land back and reconciliation and understanding of the traditional ownership, I should say traditional stewardship. Because that's what we all, I think, hope to be, is the stewards of our communities, and to work together on that.
Isn't that all
But-
we really actually are, ever, is really only stewards?
Yes. But, go ahead.
Indigenous are definitely stewards of the lands. You know, we do it, in recognition of, our ancestors, and we only borrow these areas from our future generations. We have to look after it in the now and make it, leave it in a better condition than when we got here, and use that land.
So I think, Amy, if I've got you right, that's a future that we can begin to shoot for and move towards.
I think so. As I often bring things back to climate change and health because that's where my mind almost always is. But there's so much traditional knowledge that has been lost or is not emphasized that is so important for the governance of our, not the governance, for the stewardship of the territories that we live on, and the health of those ecosystems that we all rely on. And we're just starting to integrate that back, but at the same time, so much has happened to so many communities that we need to build back those relationships and trust. Because it's a gift to have traditional knowledge shared with you is quite a gift to be asked for and to receive.
Right.
So I think, as we go forward, figuring out how to build those trusting relationships and those ways to work together to look after the ecosystems and the land and the peoples is going to be really important. So I think we're taking small steps now, but I think my hope is that it all builds to something bigger together.
I wonder if one of the questions, so as you know, I too have been quite vocal in the area of the environment, and I'm interested in that. And I wonder if what you've said is the beginnings of the way forward. It's quite often a question is asked, like, how are we going to do these things? How are we going to make these changes? Well, maybe these are the beginnings of the answers. This is the beginning of the answer. Look at some of the traditions that came before us. We always want to look at our own answers. We always want to look at capitalism and the rules that we're living by right now. But maybe there is another way, and that we need to begin to talk to the First Nations people who were here before us, and maybe there's something out of that. Another word that's come up a lot today has been the word opportunity, which is really an interesting thing for me. Because again, there are going to be people, I can't help but thinking, and it's been my experience, political experience, that there's always somebody saying that can't be done. And how are we going to, not using the word growth, but how are we going to grow into this? I was lucky enough a decade ago now to have lived a year in Australia. And one of the things that I noticed about that was most of the people that I came in contact with day after day looked like me. They were like me and my family. And I found it was just like home. And like it was just too much home. And the land was different but very similar. But the thing that I saw, which was most interesting to me, was the culture of the Indigenous people there. And I was fascinated by it, and I think that that's what drew me to that country all my life, wanting to be there. And I wonder if there's so many people who are like that in other places in the world who are drawn to Canada because of the Indigenous history that's here. And maybe that's the opportunity in our future by making a more solid connection. And when we make these name changes, they draw people to us because they're different than what we saw. We become more of, it's the history, the prehistory that will draw people. Is that part of the opportunity that we could see to the future? And more importantly, to Ed, am I way off base? And that's not what we should be looking at, because I could be completely wrong. Is that something that we should be thinking in terms of? That we have this rich history that we completely is completely being blocked out by constant advertising for McDonald's and the Super Bowl and the Stanley Cup all the time. We're missing something rich and new to us that we should all be enjoying, a whole different kind of way of life.
Well, a lot of the various Indigenous First Nations, some are more advanced than others, and in some situations too, the multi-generational traumas have occurred, and culture was almost wiped out. And even in my own community, there's only a couple of us language keepers there, and we've just been in this revitalization project for the language itself in the last 7 years. I was actually part of the initiative that started back in about 2015 to start bringing some of the language back, because it's actually a cornerstone of culture. And Kwikwetlem used to be a longhouse, big house, smokehouse kind of a community way back at at the early 1900s and earlier. And so there's other nearby nations too. They do have their longhouses. They have a lot of culture that is very rich there. I can think of many just within a 50-kilometer radius. And there's I think the world they probably do have definitely an interest in seeing a lot of things like that too. But it is a very, very diverse continent. I like to call it Turtle Island. It's how it's Canada and USA is called in my Indigenous circles. We call it Turtle Island. I don't know if anybody else here in this room knew that, but but it's it's very, very diverse. But bringing out the Indigenous cultures and stuff too. I mean, people that can make it to powwows. I mean, those are like wide open. The doors are just open for all folks to come in and witness the events. The fantastic dancing and the drumming and singing that takes place in there, and then you have the vendors there and everything too. So it's there's a lot to see. For the world to come and partake in, and Canada definitely has a lot to offer, when it comes to this kind of a thing.
I think that's right. I think there's some amazing, we use the word opportunity. I was fortunate in my last career as a photographer that I traveled to Haida Gwaii, the Nass Valley, throughout the interior and into Soyuz and places, Vancouver Island, Alert Bay, very remote places. And there's a fantastic culture there. Unfortunately, a lot of it was wiped out, both language and physical pieces of culture were lost back in the 1900s, early 1900s. But I think that what I found from going and traveling around BC is that the starting point, I think, centers around culture and environment. And I think that those are the things that we can start to build on. The environment, certainly, First Nations who were stewards of the land for millennia before we were here. And with the new awareness of climate, that I think there's an opportunity to partner with our First Nations to look for better ways to steward the lands. In terms of culture, I think that there's opportunities for both First Nations certainly, and for newcomers to share that culture. When I think back to my early days with museums and heritage, we had a very small collection of anything prior to colonial days. And so there's a whole culture and history there that I don't think most people have had a chance to fully explore. And when I look now, there's talk about making changes at the Royal Museum in Victoria. And the opportunity to really sort of look and sort of say, are we in balance telling us a story? When you would go through a museum and 95% of everything was post-colonialism, and yet our history went for millennium before that. And so there's an imbalance of what's being presented in terms of British Columbia history. But I think that people come here for the beauty of BC, and I think when most people travel, I want to see the culture of those. If I'm traveling to countries like Italy or other countries, I don't want to see 20th century. I don't want to go to McDonald's. I don't want to see that. I want to see what this country really has to offer. And I think that Canada, British Columbia, and even locally, specifically locally here, we have an opportunity to work with our First Nations to help them tell that story. And I think that that's where I really look forward to becoming partners and helping, and again, looking at their leadership, because they understand their history more than we do. I'm really here to learn, and I hope that through this journey that we will learn more.
And I think to add to that, when we're talking about opportunity, like the opportunity for community building is also huge. And there's a lot that we need to do for that. Like coming out of COVID, we've learned about social isolation, we've learned about a lot of racism that was kind of operating underneath what most people saw anyway. Mm-hmm. And in Port Moody, we've been really lucky. Tasha Faye Evans has been working on the House Post project for a couple of years now.
Is it at Mossman Creek?
It's at Nunes Creek, actually.
Nunes Creek. My apologies
No
to
worries.
Nunes Creek.
Yeah, there are a number of wonderful hatcheries around the Tri-Cities. And going to the events pre-COVID, and actually even during COVID, the diversity of folks who attended was really beautiful. Little tiny ones with their families, with beautiful headscarves on, elders from all different backgrounds coming together to learn and to celebrate the stories that we've been gifted by some of the folks who presented, or going on a plant walk through Rocky Point Park to learn about the traditional uses of plants. Mm-hmm. All of those type of things, are so important for community building and for understanding cross-culturally and for uplifting stories and heritage that was lost. And I think, there's a couple of things, through unfortunate events in the world. I remember going to an event where this lovely Persian woman said, I love being here, and I feel such a kinship to the nations because I feel like Indigenous people went through something like what I went through when I was displaced by my family. And I remember when the Syrian refugees were coming over, Audrey Siegel from Musqueam saying, like, when my family, a long time ago, when they saw someone coming in need, they would just help them. They would ask no questions. They would just help them. So of course we need to welcome these folks. And I think that those kind of stories and that kind of kinship and that kind of compassion and that kind of history is really important for bringing our communities together in the world that we live in, with so many different things going on with the pandemic and the climate crisis and displacement all over the world. There's so much that we need to learn, but there's a lot that can bring us together too.
So if I understand you correctly, from what you're saying, I couldn't help but hear that by being sensitive towards place names and by removing statues that hold trauma in other people's eyes, we are creating a template to deal with other forms of racism, and that by doing those things, by being sensitive to other people, by being sensitive to people of color, there are great benefits for us, as opposed to just protecting our own privilege. Speaking as we three are, people who look like us, with the privilege that white people have, there is great benefits for us to change.
There is great benefits, and people do, the people that even are on there who do perpetuate racism still like have the impacts, like there are mental health impacts of that on the white community as well. But I think it's also important to highlight in this talk and in general that like in Canada and in colonized countries, it's a very specific type of racism that's happened to Indigenous peoples. And that was the In Plain Sight report when we heard about the racism within the medical profession within BC. That's something very specific that we need to deal with. And it doesn't always translate exactly to other forms of racism. So we do need to learn from it for sure, but we also need to be very mindful that like Indigenous specific racism and the atrocities that happened in residential schools are very specific to where we are now.
I think the injury that it caused is specific, but the topic, and without going too far into that topic, the topic itself, the Indigenous experience informs the rest of it, and that there's an opportunity for us to learn, another opportunity for us to learn from all of that. This is a big subject, and I think that I'm going to take it into many different directions if I'm not careful. I'm wondering if there's anything anybody else wants to just finish up with in our conversation today.
I'd love to give Sheikh Hall the last word.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think, Ed, from an optimistic point of view, how do you feel optimistic in what you see going on when we're talking about when we see in the news statues being removed that cause harm to First Nations people and or like locally, when we make these efforts, is that a good sign?
In a very short answer, it gives me hope, and I do see some commonalities, from all angles, wanting to do the right thing and acknowledge everybody, including First Nations, and I'm glad this conversation is not just focused just on First Nations, because there's a lot of others who have been marginalized too, along the way. And I do have hope, and I don't know everything, about all the histories of the people who those statues are, put up to commemorate. But I too just recently learned about Edgar Dewdney, after this came to light, and so I did a bit of research, and obviously there's a lot more research that I could be doing for some other things there. But park names, even as far away as Port Coquitlam, I know that's not the talk here, but there's a Settlers Park over there, and there's these kinds of things that are we have to have talks about a lot of different things, because they are triggers for people who've had traumatic experiences, and it's not so much of my generation, it's the generation before me and before those generations, and I do have hope, as the days and weeks and months pass, that that there is some good work being done by municipalities and you know, different levels of the government. It's given me hope, and I even see that too within some of the folks you know, that in my community, and you know.
Well, hope is a good place for us to end, I think, today. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank especially the people who have taken the time to listen to this informative and large conversation that we've had today. I think that there's a lot for us to take in. I'd like to also take the time to thank the Port Moody Station Museum for having us today, and most importantly, thank you for watching.
I'd like to be able to thank all of you too, and to thank my co-guests here for you know, being a part of this. I thank you very much. I raise my hands to both of you.